So I wanted to put forward for today's discussion a thought around prosperity and how it is we're going to think about the mechanisms of prosperity through one particular kind of tool, which I'm going to call decolonial foresight. And I'm using this kind of tool and talk based on a recent paper of ours that I've linked at the bottom. And I thought, as we are a group who are discussing the problem or the question of AI and shared prosperity, perhaps we could open up a discussion together about what it is we are collectively thinking when we say the word prosperity, and sort of what our imaginations are. So I think what I would like us to do is maybe expand our conceptualization of this term prosperity. And I think there are two dimensions that I wanted to put forward. One of them is the material dimension, which is around economic prosperity. And usually when we use the word prosperity, sort of the economic prosperity is implied. But I think there is also an immaterial dimension. Those are questions of dignity of people, of environmental sustainability, about our happiness as people, the role of active citizenship, which we need so much more today than ever before, the role of creating new kinds of effective community where we have filiation beyond different kinds of racialized or tribalized or national boundaries and definitions between us. And so I think, and of course you could map these immaterial dimensions towards an economic dimension, but I think that would remove some of the fullness of these immaterial questions of prosperity that is worthwhile for us to discuss today. And so I wanted to just put forward that as we are thinking about AI and the technology of the future, and we are thinking about prosperity that is associated with technology in the future, but because we are living in the present, that binds us to the types of technology and to the prosperity that we have today. And also it binds us to the way we have inherited those technologies and prosperities from the past. And so I think this question of thinking of both the past and the present and using that as a tool to the future is generally captured in this broader area of foresight or foresight methodologies more generally. So foresight methodologies are ways and tools that we use to think about how technology will create or shape the future. And we have many tools of foresight. We have Delphi surveys, you can do survey analysis, you can do comparative policies, you can look at them through times and across different kind of countries, and you can do foresight through many kinds of economic mechanisms as well. And I wanted to put forward that the kind of questions of prosperity that we are thinking of are going to require new forms of foresight from us, and that we are going to need to develop some new forms of foresight. And one of those missing tools of foresight is the advantage that we have through historical hindsight. And so that is the main point of what I want to do today. And although these bigger questions of material and immaterial development are very large questions, and though we are particularly working in very specific areas, specific companies, specific industries, and specific sectors, when we use the tool of foresight, we can use that to focus our attention, to focus our efforts on the kinds of interventions that we can actually work in and that we are ourselves acting in. And so I think that can give us the kind of focus on where it is that we can actually make change. So I think there is one important shared experience that we all have, and that is an experience of colonialism and its remnants. There is no part of the world that is today not shaped by several centuries long history of colonialism. And I want to just make that point that we are speaking today in English because of that kind of colonial experience that we are all sharing, rather than some other language that we would have been speaking otherwise. Our national borders are shaped by colonialism. Our internal borders within our countries are shaped by those histories of colonialism. And today our ongoing discussions around the passport, the kind of capital market that we are dealing within, the labor practices we have, they're all remnants and they are all created through a foundation of colonialism. And of course, we are also relying today on technology that is dependent on inequalities that we have created through colonialism. And I want to just emphasized that colonialism and that experiment of colonialism and that need and drive for empire was to put forward one particular dimension of prosperity. I don't think that is the dimension and definition of prosperity that any of us today and here in this meeting are thinking about. And so again, I think there is these questions of the hindsight that we have through our shared colonial experience. That is what I want us to turn, not from just a shared experience, not from something that we only think about historically and when we are celebrating heritage and thinking about commemoration, but that we turn it into a tool, and particularly into a tool of foresight. So historical colonialism is defined in many different dimensions. And I'm going to talk about historical colonialism, but while I'm going to say that, I want to also recognize that today there are many people and places that are experiencing modern day colonialism, whether they are in West Papua or South Ossetia or Western Sahara or Kashmir or in Palestine or Chagos Islands and many others. So I don't want to detract from the ongoing issues that those people and places are experiencing today. But when we look at our history, historical colonialism was enacted through territorial appropriation, through exploitation of the natural environment, through exploitation and enslavement of people, and the direct control of social and economic structures. So in this way, this motion and need for colonialism and its drive sought to exert power over every part of land and life across the world, and it did that to advance one particular idea of prosperity. And so, of course, you can remove the colonial power, you can end a form of colonialism, but the structures it has put in place, the mechanisms and thinking, the kind of psychological damage that is put in place remains. And so today we would often use a slightly more general term of coloniality. And so we'll say that coloniality is what survives colonialism. And so I think when we think about this role of coloniality, which is living today, it is going to ask us questions of values and power that are at play and underlying all the conversations that we are having about technological prosperity in many different dimensions. And so I think it's worthwhile for us to surface during our discussion what these questions of values are and what the kind of power systems are. I think particularly we can look at what the levers of power and technological power are, and those levers of power are also the levers of institutional decision-making, which part of our work is to think about how it is we can think of alternative levers of institutional decision-making. And so perhaps if you are taking an economic view, you would say that some of the levers of power are typically in three. There are around instruments. Those are the institutions, the regulation, policy framework, practices. You also couple that with technologies that are being used, and maybe also coupling that with ideologies. And this triple of institutional decision-making, that is one form. When you look at this colonial heritage, then we may have a different kind of levers of power. They're in two different types of scholars, and one an axis of 4 dimensions of coloniality exerts power in dimensions of authority, of economy, of gender and sexuality, and knowledge and subjectivity. And then there is geopolitics, race, and gender. And what we can do to add more color is to identify the metropoles of technological power and the peripheries who are contesting that power. And so you can do an analysis of analyzing in today, where are the sites, those places where we see coloniality at play within our work as technologists, as designers of AI, as policymakers, as leaders of large companies. So you have many mechanisms of power, of economics, of language, of knowledge, of culture that are shaping contemporary life, and those are one that we need to think of. So in our work, we looked at 5 areas: national policies and AI, beta testing and how it is we are developing new kinds of software around ghost workers, justice, particularly around dispossession and exploitation, and the role of development. So I won't go through all of these in detail. They are complex areas, and I think the role of highlighting these 5 areas is that there's not just simply a story of good and bad. There are lots of complexity, but within all of these, there is an element of coloniality which is shaping our thinking and then shaping about how it is we are thinking about shared prosperity. And so one of them is the famous question of ghost workers. So ghost workers are about removing distally employment of certain kinds of labor practices. The one that we see most often is around the labeling of data sets for AI, where all the common knowledge that we as people have need to be put into a data set. And the labeling of these data centers today depends in large part on post-colonial inequalities, because the work is done in those former colonies, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. So, and it's again, that complexity comes that there is a tension between supporting economic development on one hand and the role of extraction on the other hand, because we take their knowledge, their expertise, their human capacities, but we don't put in place those kind of structures and supports. So going back to last week's conversation, is this the type of category of work that Anton called labor using work that we want to make as part of our conception of prosperity? And I'll just link to a little podcast documentary that I was part of around will AI kill development, that touched on this question of ghost workers. Another one is around social development, about how we think of developing different countries, and ethics dumping comes up in one area where we have companies that are failing to consider social context of the implications of their work, using lowering ethical standards or sidestepping regulation in other kinds of places. And you see what is seeping through the inheritance of coloniality and colonial thinking is this idea of benevolence, of paternalism, and going into places without understanding the cultural and political context. And the national policies on AI is another very important one. This is a graph which just shows those countries that have put forward ethical standards on AI. And I think the map tells you the story that this wants to put forward. And this is a sort of a graph of around 2018, all the different countries that have put forward national policies for strategy of development of AI. And I think when you look at these, they surface other kinds of questions of path dependency in the way that policies are developed for countries, and particularly you have very advanced economies versus others, and how those path dependencies come up. So I think these decolonial thinking, and when we use a lens of decolonization to think about the problems and the work and our work of prosperity, there'll be at least three solutions that I think about. One of them is to maybe reimagine our field of AI into one that is a critical technical practice of AI that takes the middle ground between technical work and the work of critique and criticism. And I think maybe this is one address to the one question that we looked at last week. Then to look at a core component of decolonial action, which is around reverse tutelage, that what the communities that we are learning from and working from, those communities at the margin, they have important elements and sources of knowledge that we need to and must learn from, and how it is we create those mechanisms of reciprocal pedagogy are needed, and the other one around creating new forms of political and effective community. So takeaways for our Shared Prosperity Initiative: I wanted us to consider a broader definition of prosperity that considers both the material and immaterial dimensions of development and prosperity. And I think that question will lead us to make a decolonial turn. And that decolonial turn is then going to ask us to take advantage of historical hindsight to develop new tools of foresight. And so I wanted us to raise some critical questions about technological development and power, and by assessing those elements of development and power using insights of decoloniality. So my three provocations for you all are: what alternative mechanisms of shared power are needed to create pathways towards shared prosperity? So linking power and prosperity. The second one is: what would it take to make the experiences of developing countries and the economic impact on them more viscerally pressing to the AI developer community and those who have roles of leadership? And what are specific actions of reverse tutelage we can enact across our industry? So thank you again for the great opportunity, and looking forward to the discussion.